Here
Up
they
with
come.
it. Oh, look at that.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. So nice to see many of you. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue our series celebrating accomplished women in Oregon. Just a reminder that we will be recording today's presentation for those unable to attend. If you do not want to be on camera, you can turn off your camera. We are so excited to have our speaker today. Representative Tawna Sanchez is joining us, and second part of our four-part series on accomplished women in Oregon. And this was part of our celebration of International Women's Day and Month. To have this event on the very week of International Women's Day, which was on the 8th. This year's theme is Break the Bias. And we will be talking a little bit about ways that we can all play a part in helping to break the bias and improve gender equity and equality. We are so excited to have a series this month, and we have two more speakers. After today, I want to once again thank our awesome advisory council activity committee for helping to arrange such esteemed speakers. We are incredibly honored and grateful to have our pool of speakers who will be sharing their life experiences, really highlighting the important contributions and achievements of women in our area, and speaking about their own personal journey. Representative Sanchez will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. At the end of that time, we'll be opening it up for questions. Questions, again, can be put in the chat, as well as just raising your hand. And I'm looking forward to robust conversation at that time. I am so excited to introduce all of you to Representative Tawna Sanchez, who I have had the honor and privilege to work with as a colleague as well through her position at NAYA, which has an elder program. Representative Tawna Sanchez has spent her life working to strengthen our community. Tawna is Shoshone Bannock, Ute, and Carrizo, and she grew up in Portland, Oregon, and for many years has been a leader fighting for the rights of women, Indigenous people, and the most vulnerable. As the Director of Family Services at the Native American Youth and Family Center NAYA, Tawna helped create the Early College Academy, expanded early childhood services, affordable housing development, elder support, and assisted in building a nationally recognized domestic violence wraparound service model. Over time, Tawna has helped raise 18 foster kids and has been active in state policymaking, serving as the Family Services Review Commission and Child Welfare Advisory Committee. As a state representative, Tawna remains committed to standing up for social justice on the side of the oppressed and pushing to make our systems more equitable. And with that, a very warm welcome to one of Oregon's accomplished women, Representative Tawna Sanchez.
Thank you. I love the virtual applause. What we don't like, of course, is when it's all out loud and you can barely hear anything because everybody's talking or the sound that's over everything. I wait for the day when we will be able to be in person again, and you can actually, make noise and it won't be cut off by other people's sound. So anyway, well, thank you all for being here today. I think this is obviously a great opportunity for me too to talk to folks in the community. So I appreciate that very much. I will start off by saying that one of the things that's very difficult for me as a Native American, it is not normal that we talk about ourselves. And that was a difficult thing coming into politics, trying to have those conversations over and over again with people, explaining who I am, explaining what I've done, talking about, my path, and then really just again, trying to say it about myself. It's not something we do culturally, is really build ourselves up and say, oh, I'm the best person for this job. You should choose me over someone else. That's a hard thing. So we can get into that maybe a little bit more, a little bit later on. But I will tell you, first of all, my parents lived on, I think it was 84th or 86th, right up the road here when I was born. I was actually born in Salem. And I think I was born in Salem because my mother's two older sisters lived there. And she wanted to be closer to her sisters when she was having me. And so it was I was one of those breech babies. What does that say, right? Like it's starting it all out differently. But I often just really say that just because I want to recognize that, being from here, growing up off and on most of my life here, this is my city, this is my place, this is what I understand to be what I should advocate for. And not just my, Native population, but all populations, that are from here in Oregon. I just think that's really, really important. So having been born in Salem, raised off and on mostly in Portland, and actually I lived at one point in my life, several points I would imagine, right here in my own district. And I've spent the last 25 plus years living in this district. So I represent a place that, is familiar to me. My dad worked on Union Avenue back in the day, which is now Martin Luther King, at Surefoot Auto Upholstery, right? That was where he worked. And, he was an amazing person who taught me in my life that I had to live above reproach, so that I was not allowed to do things that I would be ashamed of later on, and that somebody would come back and say something to me about. So hopefully I have done that well enough and have not embarrassed him in any way. I think he'd be quite proud of where I am right now. But I just wanted to say that out loud, because again, that's a foundation of who I am, to live above reproach, to recognize that I have a responsibility in my life to do things in the best possible way. And I also just probably should say out loud too, I have a 7-month-old kitty in this house, and she is likely to fly someplace or make noise in the back because I can hear her behind me right now. And so back to where I'm at. I think that's been for me a foundation in becoming a person who dealt with politics, partly because I also know that the foundation of the whole structure of government that we have here in this country, with representatives and senators and governors and all of that whole legislative process or congressional process, same structure, right? That all came from the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy. That was a tribal structure for governing. And then the people who were chosen to be those representatives or those senators, we didn't call them that. Representative might be a better term for it, but all of those different stages of things, the people who were chosen to sit in those positions were chosen by clan mothers. They were chosen by women. And they were chosen by those clan mothers because those clan mothers watched those children grow up. And they paid attention to them, and they recognized who was that giving person, and who was that sharing person, and who was that person that took care of others, that supported the community, that throughout their whole life that they were paying attention to everyone and supporting everyone rather than just working for themselves. That for me, and growing up and knowing about that and having that education myself as a Native person, it solidified for me where I needed to be in terms of how I thought about leadership. That being pushed into leadership is really the best way to go about these things, right? To be, I was never, as I said, fundraising also was very hard for me because I couldn't stand there and go, oh, give me money. That's so culturally inappropriate. I need you to give me money for my campaign, or I want, give me this much money or something. It was very, very difficult for me because, again, that was not part of my culture. Knowing that our culture is very much about representation by people that we believe are going to be the best support for us as community and as families or extended families and all of that type of thing. This was always going to be a rough ride for me personally. So again, more of that just about foundationally where I grew up, where I understand my life to be, where I understood politics. I also understood in politics that there was an inequity, right? There was an inequity, not just for people of color, but for women in general. And if you look deep into our constitution of this country, it was not designed for women at all, right? It wasn't designed for people of color necessarily. Like we barely got a mention in there in some instances. And I think that, it's taken such a long time for us to get to a place where women have a little more power in the structures, right? There was a time back in the day where women couldn't own their own property, right? Even if it was passed down, from a relative to them, it was very hard for women to hold property and for women to hold power. I mean, they did it obviously in lots of different ways, but structurally in this country and many other countries, it's very, very difficult for women. And you got to ask yourself, why is that? Why is it like that? I can't give you a solid answer for that. But what I do know is that in this country, prior to Europeans coming, oh, there's the tail, that women held power in a different way. We actually had as I mentioned, that clan mother situation, and in many different tribes throughout the country, there was I'm going to take you off of there, sorry, because otherwise she's going to step on the button and actually cut me off. But there were many different ways that women held power. Women held power in terms of land structures, because women were the life givers, right? There was that full recognition that women gave life, that power was so very, very important, that it was recognized in many different ways, so that women grew things. They took care of the gardens. They took care of the gathering. Men hunted, but women gathered, right? You have to have it all. You can't just have one or the other, right? Everything has to come together. And there was a balance in the way people did things. But women were warriors as well. Women were, took care of lots of different things, and they stood in battle many, many times. Over, to take care of the families and communities when necessary. In tribal structures, there were many different, different tribes all over the country did things a little bit differently, but very much in general, there was at least a balance and an understanding of what the power of women was, and recognizing that you can't have it all differently. But sadly, when Europeans came and things like treaties and that whole business of a different power structure, women were relegated, sadly, to a different place in this country. And there was, unfortunately, when you're oppressed, you tend to oppress other people, right? They say that hurt people, right? And so recognizing when that type of thing happened, that there was a different structure that people were looking at. Native people, for the most part, across the country, were forced into boarding schools. That doesn't mean everybody had to go had that boarding school experience. But go on, go get that. There you go. But a lot of people did, and that meant that the way they treated each other, or grew up with each other, or spent time with each other, sometimes got to be hard. And we have sort of a generational kind of what's the right thing? We refer to it as historical trauma, but we have a generational way of dealing with things, sadly, Because if someone was taken into a boarding school at 5 years old and their hair was cut off and they weren't allowed to speak their language and they weren't allowed to practice their culture, what can you imagine would happen to them in terms of the way they feel about themselves and the way they understand what child rearing looks like, right? So you have a different relationship then with yourself and with other people around you based on what you grew up with. And sadly, when children grew up in that boarding school era, that was a little hard. And it changed the way we interacted with one another. It changed a lot of times our foundation of respect for one another, but it also changed just how we understood emotion to be. And so those things are really important to sort of recognize historically. And I think we're all sort of sitting in a situation right now where we wonder about where our foundation of how we will interact in the future is going to be, right? Think about that as we are getting to a place where we're so hopefully post-pandemic, our own interactions and how we interact with children is going to be very, very different. I'm sorry, this is not happening here. Stop. Sorry, my phone just keeps going off and I don't know why. Anyway, that piece I think is a very important part of who I am and how I grew up, understanding how inequities and how oppression and racism played a huge part in how we did things in this country. And, as I said, I grew up in my district at a time when Martin Luther King Boulevard was Union Avenue. It was actually very, very, it was a community of color very distinctly, back in the 60s and 70s, very distinctly a community of color. Lots of Black and Brown owned businesses, which of course, unfortunately, most of which are gone now, right? Because there was a change, there was a shift. And, there was a full recognition of how things were done differently at that point in time. I think as we moved forward, sort of recognizing how, how as a society and a country we lived with racism and oppression and what maybe happened. I mean, you got to say it out loud. What happened to people? How people were treated and how we have to figure out how we do that different going forward. That's a really important conversation to have. And I know it's hard, and I know it feels really, hurtful to have to a certain degree, because we don't want to, it's not so much own it, but say it out loud, like how awful things have been in the past and how we're trying so hard to shift and change those things while still recognizing that did we personally do something oppressive or hurtful? Maybe not. And so it's still hard. But again, all of those kinds of things just sort of like are the history of who I am and how I got to where I am right this very minute. And we're sort of the foundations of that decision to step up and do the political thing. And so I will tell you how that happened, interestingly enough. Back in November of 2015, then Senator Chip Shields decided to retire from the legislature. And then Representative Lou Frederick decided to jump for his seat, which he told me took him 2 minutes. Like the moment the announcement was made, he filed for the seat, for the Senate seat. He said, I was on the computer in 2 minutes and had made that happen, which I thought was quite funny, actually. But later that evening, literally that evening, I got a text message from a friend of mine who basically explained all of that, like, this happened. You should run for that seat, in a text message. And my response to him in a text message was, wah, ha, 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 ha. Because I thought, oh, you're out of your mind. Why would I do that? Why would I do something like that? And his response is, I'm not kidding. I'm serious. You should think about it. And, he laid out, text message, which were going back and forth. He laid out the reasoning. At that point in time, we had not been aware of any Native person that has ever served in the Oregon legislature. And come to find out later on, I am actually the second Native person to serve in the Oregon legislature. Jackie Taylor was Citizen Potawatomi, and she served back in the mid-90s. So knowing that and thinking about that, one of the first thoughts that ran through my head, and again, the rationale that my friend had for saying, like, we need you to do this, was that representation matters, right? It does matter. It does matter whose voice is in the room and who has the conversation and who says what about an issue. And I will tell you, just backing up a little bit, I early in my life, I was a little bit of a radical, and I would, anti-uranium mining, coal mining, injustices in the world, all of that type of thing. But at one point I decided that I could, change the world on a lot of different levels from that perspective, and then look at my community and recognize that we were still struggling emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, all of that kind of thing. And so I actually went back to school, and I got a degree in psychology and communications from Merrillhurst, and then went back again later on and got a master's degree in social work. I also have a certificate in alcohol and drug studies from UC Berkeley. Like, all of those things were sort of part of my process of formalized education. But I think that all sort of, again, really was for me about making sure that I knew enough to be able to support my community. And then when that opportunity came to run for office, I thought, okay, I work now at NAYA Family Center, which Amber mentioned earlier, and actually just celebrated 25 years at NAYA Family Center last week on the 3rd, March 3rd. And I watch people every single day be affected by the laws that we make in this state, be affected by the financial decisions, because let me tell you, many, many times I did a lot of those same marches that we all end up doing, or those same meetings that we all end up doing, in particular for senior services, OPI, and all of that being cut off and whittled down and all of that. So I was at many of those rallies over the years, and I get to make those decisions now. Like, that is the amazing part of this, because I know what it does to people on the ground, right? I can see it every single day in the real life job that I have that pays the bills. And I say it that way because the legislature does not pay much, just to be real, right? It was an opportunity for me to look at, my history and the work that I've been doing, and saying that does matter. It is extremely important that people have the perspective of a working social worker, of somebody on the ground who knows what this means and what the decisions that we make in the legislature have to do with the people on the ground. And they cannot be arbitrary. They cannot be just, one-offs or decisions that, we put money here one year and then we don't put money there the next year. That makes a huge difference. And so then I made the decision to do it. And another thing about me is that if I say I'm going to do something, I do it, and I do it full tilt all the way. Never give up, and I cannot be stopped. Generally speaking, cannot be stopped. If I say I'm going to do it, I will do it, and I have to have a darn good reason why not, if I'd stop. So I had an opponent in the primary, which was very interesting. My opponent actually outraised me by about $40,000, which is a really stunning thing. Like, that's a lot of money, $40,000. She raised $40,000 more than me. She got all the big PACs, a lot of big money. And my determination really was to walk and be on the doors and talk to people and do all of those types of things, which I felt like was really, really important, because that's easy, a lot easier for me than raising money by calling people and asking them for money. So I did a lot of that, and I won my primary by 168 votes. So I'm a state legislator by 168 votes. And actually, interestingly enough, this is the very first year that I actually have an opponent in this race this year. So I haven't had one before, and who knows why that is? Who knows what the sort of political things this way or the other are about that? But I will say that, having been in the legislature, this is my 5th year actually in service since 2017. I have chaired Human Services, I've chaired Judiciary, I've chaired Behavioral Health, and last year I got to make some really great investments in behavioral health. And this year I am the co-chair of Ways and Means. So it's been an interesting and amazing journey. I feel like I've hit a massive learning curve on the Ways and Means thing, but it is actually it makes a lot of sense to me now going in the door. And now I have a better understanding of how the finances work in the state. And I also have a better decision-making capacity there as well, which is really exciting, right? You get to be the one that says yes or no about certain things. And, here's the reality. We're not always going to make everybody happy. It's the way it is. Legislating is what I've learned about legislating, it is about compromise. We have to have conversations with each other. Both sides, all sides have to have conversation. We have to come to an equitable and or middle ground, whatever that is. And, if we can't get to that place, then maybe we have to decide differently how we do it. And I know money is a big thing for, all of our systems and how we work and how we do things, but we have to continue to figure all of those things out on an ongoing basis, right? But I will tell you, the opportunity that I have to advocate for the people that I serve has actually been really, really amazingly important to me. And recognizing also that I don't just serve the people in my district. I serve the entire state of Oregon, right? And the decisions that we make in the legislature are not just about one district. You represent that district, but you're making decisions for the entire state of Oregon. That is the fact of the matter, right? It's not as simple as, this side or that side. And you have to look at the entire state to recognize that, everything has to be balanced in some way, shape, or form. So that's a little bit about me.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing some of your journey to this point. So grateful for your advocacy. Really struck by just hearing a little bit around the ancestry and how that has so influenced your outlook, your approach to work, and to be in a position of service and support, and really struck by your comment about representation and how much it matters, and to be only the second Native individual in the legislative, that we have a long way to go as well. But so grateful to have you in this role and to advocate and represent. We're going to open it up to some questions. I know I've got some questions as well, but let's begin with Justine Crane.
I gotta tell you, you touched my heart greatly, because I'm obviously, if you could see me, a white European American female. However, I've lived my life in the hearing loss community, and the service, the people who have helped me the most have been people of Native American tribes, namely my biggest mentor of all, who was also deaf. And I get reprimanded repeatedly because I'm white, serving an underserved community, because I did social work for people with hearing loss who were also elderly. And talk about living at crossroads. That's the major crossroads in the society. And one of the questions I have for you, knowing where my filter is, is, I'm not speaking for the entire disabled community. I'm speaking for those who have hearing loss, irregardless of age and where their hearing loss is, deaf or late deafened. Okay? Do you serve also and represent and educate yourself on the needs of those people, irregardless of age, who have hearing loss?
Absolutely. I actually ran a couple of bills over the last couple of sessions, in particular to assure that the agency, just recently, that the agencies that serve deaf and hard of hearing community actually have a certified licensure certification for people who use ASL. And I will tell you, when I first came into the legislature, oh God, his name just also Chad Ludwig. Do you know who Chad Ludwig is? Huge advocate for deaf and hard of hearing community. He came to me with a concern that it was just hugely emotional for me. And it was the concern that medical professionals were trying to talk parents out of teaching kids ASL. And that they were just sort of like pushing cochlear implants immediately. And the concern was about the language of American Sign Language being eliminated in some way, shape, or form. And that struck me hugely emotionally, because it was very much like that boarding school thing where you weren't allowed to speak your language. It took so long to develop the American Sign Language and get it to be identified as an actual language. It is identified as an actual language. And the medical professionals, to have the audacity to just want to eliminate that in some way, shape, or form was highly offensive to me. It was just stunningly offensive. And so I actually was, became a huge advocate for deaf and hard of hearing community. Whatever they're asking me to do, we will try to do, because I think it's so very, very important that we not discount people just because they can't hear what everybody else hears. It's just been that's just been a very, very important thing for me.
I have one last question, and I promise I'll let it go. I come from Chicago, Illinois, where there is a Chicago Hearing Society serving all people with hearing loss, irregardless of level, age, etc. The one thing I've been absolutely appalled by in the state of Oregon is there's no equivalent. And the state school for the deaf has advocated for decades that no such society exists. And there are perfect models out there in the United States that the wheel does not have to be reinvented.
Yeah.
I loved your story when you told about the Native American schools and not being allowed to speak your own language, because I grew up in the day and age, I'm 65, when people with hearing loss, their hands were tied together so that you could not use your natural language. You could, or your hands were taped down so you could not use gestural sign, and you were, granted, it was to my advantage now because I learned to speak, and I learned to speak well late. However, I don't believe anyone's native language should be restrained in any way whatsoever while trying to assimilate into the natural native culture, the culture you sit in.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Please continue to tell that story. And
I
know it's against the Native American culture, no matter what tribe you come from, to speak up like that. But please keep doing it, because especially now, people don't want to hear it from a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant LGBT person, that these things still exist in magnitude. If it comes from someone of color, and I've witnessed it, they're willing to hear it.
Well, I think everyone should speak, no matter where they come from, what they look like. Everyone should speak. Everyone should talk about these things and recognize that we have a history, just as a society, we have a history of oppression, that somehow or another we felt like it was okay to oppress certain populations based on some level of what we perceive to be a deficit, or not as, not as powerful in some way, shape, or form. And the fact that Oregon is ridiculously slow at doing some things, we're actually first so many times in some amazing things, but we hold fast, sadly, to some old behaviors and some old power structures that eliminate different populations from having a voice in society. And so I think those things are hugely important, and things that I advocate for on a pretty consistent basis. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. We had a question come in on the chat, and then after that we have Steve and then Tom. Can you tell us more, Tawna, about the current needs of the Native community in Portland and what people can do to better support the work of NAYA? And congratulations on, milestone, and we said 25
years, yes.
25 years. That's remarkable. Wonderful.
Yes, thank you. And current needs of the Native community in Portland, I think, for the most part, we're like everybody else. We're sort of in that moment of education being a primary issue, and really advocating for the increased capacities and that type of thing. I know that Portland Public Schools is well, they are trying to enhance the Indian Education Title VI programs. Unfortunately, they didn't have really great communication, sadly, with the tribal populations here in Portland as readily as they should have. But I think that I'm hoping that they will be able to bring that back up and have greater conversation and greater inclusion in the conversation around what we do to support Native kids in schools. I mean, I think all of our schools are going to need additional supports going forward, just because of that kind of the mental health aspects, behavioral health aspects of things going forward for everyone, every Oregonian, just to be realistic. I'm very excited about the new Balmer Institute that will take over Concordia soon, and that we will have folks who have the ability to really engage in our educational system and support kiddos who might be struggling. There is just no doubt about it. I think, even early on in the pandemic, we recognized that there would be issues with students going back to school, having been shut down even for that short period of time. What we initially hoped would be a short period of time, we anticipated that there would be struggles with kiddos going back to school and how they engaged in that type of thing. And this prolonged situation has made it even more difficult. That's not to say that it was not the right decision. I honestly, truly believe it was the right decision. If you look at the statistics here, throughout the country, Oregon has one of the lowest rates of death in the country. And whether we like it or not, how it ended up happening, our governor made some hard choices to lock it down hard so that people would survive. And, kids are, I refer to children as petri dishes, just to be perfectly frank. And having had many petri dishes in my house over the years, I recognize that sometimes it is what it is. But I know that kids have struggled quite a bit, and that's the primary issue, I think, right now in the Native population, and NAYA's ability to do that service of working with kids and families to support them staying in school and continuing their education. I think is going to be one of the more difficult things that we have going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think we won't even really understand the true impact of these last 2 years, for several years. I mean, we're seeing some immediate reactions and responses, with our youth and across the continuum with elders as well, but truly to understand how this will impact our community, it will be years. And so
Yes.
I'm really pleased to see a greater focus on behavioral health. And so thank you for your work in helping to bring about more support for that. Steve, your hand is up, and then Tom after Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. And thanks a lot for sharing your story with us today. And I'm really happy that you've been able to find such meaningful work at the state legislature and at NAYA. And I've heard a little bit about NAYA, but I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little more about what NAYA is up to these days.
Okay. So, well, I could start by saying I got my job at NAYA, 25 years ago, and I was actually the second person hired in this incarnation of NAYA. So NAYA's been around for 48 plus years, maybe. And I was actually a kid in NAYA programming all of those years ago. Yeah. So it ebbed and flowed as a community organization, getting small grants here and there. But in 1996, we got our first big opportunity to bring resources into NAYA Family Center. It was NAYA, Native American Youth Association at that time, and started with some after-school programming monies. And I was there was the executive director then, Susan Balbus, and then I was hired, and we started bringing on sort of newer programs, just fairly decently at a decent clip then at that point in time. And right now, NAYA has several major components to it. So in my job as the Director of Family Services, I manage domestic violence programs, foster care, aging and disability and veteran services, early childhood programs, the food pantry, and a little bit of housing pieces specific to domestic violence. We also have a clothing closet. That's just my little department, right? We have youth and education services that does after-school programming, works with gang-involved youth, homeless youth. It does their college and career center. They, just lots of different components of housing in there for families who are struggling. And then we have our community development program that works on building housing. We actually have, I think it's closer to 250 units of housing now at this point in time, somewhere around there. We have different scattered sites throughout the city that we have either acquired or built ourselves, and want to continue to try to build, because as we all know, housing is a huge issue here in the city. And we have a housing department specifically that has resources that works on sort of rent assistance, energy assistance, and that type of thing, just trying to bring people into housing and trying to help them stay stabilized in that housing. So we manage sort of that, I think it was, what's it called? Is it the Region 2, District 2 or whatever of energy and housing assistance, that type of thing. And then of course we have our development department that works on just making sure that we have just bringing in additional funds to make sure that we can do some of the work that we want to do that doesn't have grants that fund it. Let me just back to the CD program. I forgot they also have IDA programs, individual development accounts, where they help people save money and then to do things like buy homes or get their education or build a business, that type of thing. We've often done tax support for people to get their taxes done and that type of thing. Community development is pretty engaged in developing small businesses and supporting, like the arts corridors and things like that. They've got a lot going on. So that's kind of the NAYA. We also have what's called the Many Nations Academy. It's alternative high school. So we have kiddos in our kiddos are actually in the building and have been for this whole year. So we've been really fortunate not to have had any great number of teachers be out or sick at any point in time, and so we've had students throughout this past year. So that's been a really amazing part of our work. And then, as you know, of course, we have our senior services program. We do we deliver meals at this point in time still, because our site is not open, just like most sites are not open. And then just as we thought, oh, we'll get to a place now where we will be open maybe in about a month, and then we're going to be doing construction on certain parts of the building. So now we actually won't be open. We'll sort of be open, but people won't be able to necessarily walk in as construction is going on to sort of mitigate some of the issues of the building. The building is pretty old, so yeah. That's NAYA.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot going. How long is the construction process
Well,
going?
It
Timeline?
depends. It's some different parts of it we hope will be taken care of relatively soon. We hope, but you might be aware that getting somebody to do construction anywhere in the city right now is very, very
Oh, yeah.
difficult.
We did a bathroom remodel here at the senior
Yes.
center, and it took twice as long and twice as expensive. For those who
Right.
might not be familiar where NAYA is located, excuse me, it's on Columbia,
Yes.
or Columbia around 70,
No, 51st.
51st, okay.
Yeah.
51st.
What's your address, Tawna?
5135 Northeast Columbia Boulevard.
Yeah, but really housing from a high school there to elder program. I mean, takes up a good city block. It's a large space, and
Right.
I'm sure everyone's pleased to see an investment in the infrastructure, but also recognizing having to work
Yeah.
around that. Tom, thank you for your patience, and then Melissa after Tom. Oh, Tom, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, broken something. I can't see it.
I know.
Tom, can
Something
you
broke.
write it in the chat maybe?
Something's broken and some.
I can't see it. Yeah, there you go. Let's see.
Concentration.
Clemency sought for activist who is ill. Oh, Peltier, Leonard Peltier. Oh, okay. I actually signed on to that letter as a legislator. One of my colleagues there's actually a group within the National Coalition, National State Legislators Conference or something like that, NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators. There is a Native American caucus in that national group, and we have signed on to a letter to help to support having clemency for Leonard Peltier. That's a very long, convoluted story. Thank you for bringing that up. But if people are at all interested, that's another topic entirely for a conversation about Leonard Peltier and he as an activist. Actually, part of his story was here in Oregon, interestingly enough, many, many years ago. And again, lots of really long conversation, really detailed stuff. So thank you for bringing that up, Tom. That's very, very important. If anybody's interested, Leonard Peltier is a Native American activist who's been in prison for many, many years for supposedly killing 2 FBI agents in South Dakota. Other people who were accused of that crime were acquitted of that crime, and evidence that was allowed into their trial was not allowed into his trial. So that is part of the reason it's such a long-term issue, but it's also just evidences sadly that our criminal justice system is flawed in a lot of ways. So.
Thank you. Melissa.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us, Representative Sanchez. This has been so interesting. And I just wanted to mention something that you probably know in your history of social work, that, one of the ways we get funding from the state is our connection to, can you hear me okay?
It's a little light.
It's a little light. Okay.
If you just speak up just a little bit more.
Turn up my volume.
There you
So
go.
I was just saying that our organization, one of the ways that we get funding from the state is our participation with Get Care. So they've just released some new data fields, which are, I think, so important to really be able to capture what communities are we serving, who are we serving, who are we not serving. But one of the data fields I thought was so interesting, and I just love to hear what you think about that. There's a question, do you live in an urban, rural, or frontier setting? And when I read that, I thought, what is this doing? Your frontier, like, how is this not connected to the history of European colonization of this land? And how would a Native American person filling out this form feel about seeing frontier as a choice for where you live? Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. I find it very problematic, but I also don't know the history of how these categories came about. you
Right.
know?
So the phrasing frontier, which is bizarre, you're right, it's a very bizarre way to put it, but it essentially means that the population is relatively small for the land base, really, really small for the land base that which it covers. And I will say that from the perspective of recognizing that, say, frontier in Oregon is places like Burns in Harney County,
Mhm.
where the population, person per mile population is extremely small, right? That's what they mean by frontier. It just means it's a huge area. If you look at the map of districts, you will see that they're based on population, right? And so there are representatives and or senators in certain districts in the eastern part of the state that represent these massive swaths of the state because their population is so small, right? And I represent a part of the state where the population in my state is so tiny, I mean, so dense. My district is very small because of how dense the population is. So my district is probably, I mean, it's, 84 and I-5 up to like 33rd and then Lombard and just a little bit of Prescott area up to like now, well, with the new redistricting, it will be up to like 46. It's very small comparatively speaking. So it's, compared to like literally thousands of miles in Eastern Oregon. So that's what they mean by frontier. They just mean the population.
Right.
It
I
doesn't
just wonder
sound
if we
weird.
could think of another term like rural, comma, sparsely populated or something that's not so tied up with the history of colonization.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, Melissa. And this is part of that real D that we've been learning about. And I think those comments should be shared, at the state level. Tom, your hand is up. It looks like you might have some.
Thank you.
The power of the voice. Okay.
Thank you. I'm finally back. I had to go by phone. My computer's broke. I'm familiar. I want to make two suggestions, and I'd like you to comment on it. There's two books that I'd like to, or authors I'd like to reference. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and her famous book, The American History of Indigenous People. And of course, in her, this is an academic, powerful academic study. But basically it states that the American original sin was settler colonialism and the indigenous genocide that's continued. But what we've seen on a worldwide basis is a reincarnation of indigenous people globally, not just here in the United States. In fact, it could be argued that you are an example of the what we call a reincarnation of the American Indians. Now, the other author, of course, is Dr. Greg Sarris, S-A-R-R-I-S, from Sonoma State College, and he's a 15 years chief in the Federated Tribes in California. But his novel, which would be much more readable for most people, is called Becoming Story. A journey among seasons, places, trees, and ancestors. And I would recommend to all my fellow panelists here, as we welcome you to the Hollywood Senior Center and the Community for Positive Aging, those sources to study up on the question that you've initiated here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think those that sounds like a really good opportunity for reading. I think there maybe the Ortiz book might be a little dense for folks, but it's good.
Well, I concur. That's why I gave you the novel too.
Yes, yes.
Tawna, our last speaker, last week, Michelle Lewis, she and her husband own a bookstore, and they are currently, it's the only bookstore that is Black owned in all of Oregon, small business. And so we talked a lot about books and book recommendations, and just kind of following up on Tom's recommendations. I'm curious if you have any book recommendations for this group. I recall that they all seem to be strong readers and interested in, like, what books do you read? When do you have time to read might be the bigger question.
Actually, hold on one second.
Okay.
This book, it's called Full Court Quest. And this is a book about, interestingly enough, it's girls from Fort Shaw Indian School. It's the basketball champions of the world. Like, this was the very first basketball champions. These are Native women from the Fort Shaw Indian School. Now, this book is essentially a work of fiction, but based on historical facts, of course. And this little lady right here, that's my great aunt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What state was this team in?
They were in Montana.
Montana.
But basically, these girls were essentially so back in the day when the boarding schools happened. And this book, it's fictionalized, and it does not delve as deeply into the really scary, horrifying things at boarding schools as some of them do. But it does touch on a lot of those issues, and it does talk about some of those stories of kids running away from the boarding schools and the things that happened to them. But it also talks, you can read, as you read it, you can read some of the pieces that they clearly gleaned some of that information from newspapers of the time, issues of the time that were, you can hear you read it and you just go, oh gosh, how hard it would have been to be called those Indian maidens, those squaws, or whatever in the storylines of the day, right? But it was the I think 1903 World's Fair. Yeah, 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. They were the champions. They were the basketball champions. So it's an amazing book. I would recommend that if people are interested.
The author? Of
Linda Peavy and Ursula Smith.
Right. Oh yeah, we will look that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. That I feel like that's certain to become a movie or something at some point. It just has all the makings of it, right?
Exactly.
That sounds like a phenomenal story. You are such a busy person, Tawna, from working as a director in a nonprofit to being a state representative and being responsive to constituents. What do you do to relax, and how often do you get to do that? I mean, we talk about the importance of self-care, and it's just remarkable all that you're able to do. And I'm just curious about, how things that you do.
Well, one of the things that is very, very important to me is, and people say that, like, how do you relax? To me, serving the community, feeding people is actually a very regenerative thing for me. Like, I like cooking. I like and actually even doing something like this, being able to talk to people about what we do, and really hopefully articulating more so what the legislature actually does, and getting people to understand, like, it isn't all as cut and dry or as bad as it all sounds sometimes. Sometimes the details are just a little bit different. And so being able to really help people understand the full, or as much as I can, maybe, how things are, maybe a little bit, see them a little bit differently than what we perceive on the news. And I actually saw somebody from KGW the other day at a different place, and just told them, I was very impressed by, at least this time they got most of it right. I have moments in time where I'm watching the news and going, that's not what that bill means. That they totally messed it up, and made people believe that it was something entirely different than it was. It was very frustrating. But to be able to sort of set the record straight once in a while, I think is actually very healing to me.
That's wonderful. A wonderful way to look at it. I know you are so busy, and you've been so generous with your time. We're going to take one more question from Justine.
Well, actually, it's a comment of my experience with animals and training them as service animals, including cats, that you must be a remarkable human being. Who picked who? Did you pick her or did she pick you?
I kind of picked her. It was actually somebody who had had kittens, but she was selling them. She's a half Bengal cat, but she definitely chose to decide to like me because she was yeah.
That must make you a remarkable person, because cats and people who can live with cats, because they have owners, not masters.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm definitely not her master. She decides. And she's not a snuggly cat. She is a very independent, sometimes flying around the room cat. But as you can see, she's back there very mellow in her spot that she insisted that I create close into my office where she could keep an eye on me.
So that must say something about you.
Yes.
That's all I wish to say.
Oh, that's great. On that note, I want to once again thank Representative Sanchez for being a part of this series, for being so generous with your time this morning and sharing your remarkable journey. Thank you so much for your advocacy, for being a leader in our community, for being a giver, for being a healer. We are so fortunate to have you in the Oregon State Legislature, as well as in the community. Thank you for all that you do to work to break the bias. Thank you for sharing with us today. We so appreciate you, and keep up the tremendous work.
Great. Thank you so much. All righty. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And as we sign off, just a reminder that next week we will continue this series of remarkable accomplished women in Oregon, and we will be joined by Diane Lynn, who is Proud Ground Executive Director. Representative Tawna spoke about the housing crisis and how housing, how critical that is. Diane Lynn is a former Multnomah County chair and represents a nonprofit that is focused specifically on housing. So you'll want to join us for that really important discussion. Thank you so much, everyone. Continue to be kind to yourselves. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and hope to see you back here next Friday. Thanks so much. Take care.